I asked Jeremy for a short bio, and I've got a page. So my short bio is 2 lines. So there we go. I'm gonna attempt to give Jeremy to what he deserves. Jeremy is a visiting professor at UCL and emeritus professor of digital healthcare at University of Southampton and former director of Essex Institute of Health Research. Advisor on the validation methods to NHS XAI Lab, member of the Medicine and Healthcare Regulatory Authorities Device Expert Advisory Committee and clinical advisor on technology to Royal College of Physicians. He currently edits the ethical digital health sections of Frontiers in Digital Health. If you have papers to publish, please do send it there. Jeremy trained in medicine in Oxford and London, and as a hospital physician in London and Glasgow, he then discovered medical informatics and health technology assessment with doctoral training at National Heart and Lung Institute at MRC, funded postdoc at Stanford University. He was the UK first elected fellow of American College of Medical Informatics in 1997. He's got many achievements. I'm just going to list a few.
Please don't, Abdul.
Oh, come on, you deserve it. Jeremy set up NICE, National Institutes of Clinical Excellence Research and R&D Program 2003 and 5, Dundee Health Informatics and eHealth Center in 2005, Warwick Institute of Digital Healthcare in 2010. And he was a member of WHO mHealth Technical Advisory Group 2010 and 12. This is what I like. Developed and taught a WHO training course in Tehran in 2017. Not many academics will travel to that country, but he was brave enough to do it, and I thank him for it. I won't say much more, but just as of 9 a.m. Pacific time, his citation number was 29,589. His HI index is 69. He's got more than 450 publications. And he's got a list of collaborators like Doug Altman, Charles Friedman, Spiegelhalter. So he has achieved so much, and I'm delighted that he's here with us and giving us a talk on clinical perspective on the use and impact of the AI tool. Thank you, Jeremy. I know we need to say more about you, but maybe in a different occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul. I feel very flattered by that introduction, and I'm not sure that I'm going to. I hope I won't disappoint everybody. So I'll press on with my talk. So really, it's really trying to put my clinical hat on and thinking from the clinical point of view. What do doctors and nurses and other health professionals want? What do they do? And what are the concerns that they have about AI? So I'll talk about that, the technical challenges, which many of them will be very familiar to you, and also what I call psychological or organizational challenges, and then talk about Enrico Chioria's brilliant idea of thinking about the last mile. So what do we actually need to do to make this AI stuff really work and help us, and the implications of that for evaluation, which has been a recurrent interest of mine over the years. And Abdul, if you look carefully, you'll see 1 or 2 examples of where you and I have collaborated. It's been delightful collaborating with you over the years. So thinking about clinicians, what do clinicians actually do? And apologies for this for the clinicians who are already here, but we clinicians are not very good at standing back from what we do and generalizing. And I think that for computer scientists and AI developers, it's often hard to really work out what it is that clinicians do and how AI can help. So the first thing that a clinician does when they see a patient is they build a relationship with that patient. And that's really necessary because you're often asking intimate questions and examining them in sensitive places. So you need a kind of therapeutic, and it can be a long-term relationship. So that relationship in itself can be quite therapeutic for the patient. You then listen to, hopefully, and examine the patient, unless the patient's unconscious, in which case all you can do is examine them. And that in itself is a very complex task. And that's why we go to medical school and train as a clinician, postgraduate training. A lot of that is about getting a good history and examination from collecting the data from the patient about their problem. We then use that information to make a fair, evidence-based, and hopefully shared decision with the patient, which it doesn't just ignore their preferences and concerns. And then communicate back to the patient, discussing options for treatment, for investigation, maybe withdrawal of treatment even. So again, that's a very complex human level task. Then, of course, we have to deliver treatments and procedures, carrying out all sorts of complex motor tasks, like hip replacements or doing a lumbar puncture, or simply writing a prescription. And then monitor the response of the patient to that treatment and adjusting the treatment accordingly. And then finally, we have to keep up to date. We have to monitor our own competence and participate in continuing professional development activity. So clinicians do quite a lot of different tasks or activities. And obviously, AI can help with many of these. And there's a table showing the tasks on the left and potential ways that AI can support. For example, even building a therapeutic relationship. Some people find chatbots very helpful to build a relationship. We know that there's a lot of ambient technology, ambient voice technology, which is used for transcribing consultations, and machine vision and pattern recognition can help in that listening to and examining the patient. But I think that there's a lot of the listening, the obtaining the history and examining the patient. I think is going to be remain a human task for quite a while yet. Making decisions, of course, AI is very good at risk prediction and decision support. There's a long history, 50-year at least history of decision support systems, not always through machine learning, often rule-based systems. Discussing the options again, risk prediction could be a big issue, and risk communication tools. We doctors aren't always very good at communicating risk, and we'll come up having an example of that in a minute. Delivering treatments, there's a whole range of e-prescribing tools, dosage calculators, infusion pumps, even surgical robots are a way of delivering treatment. Often surgical robots are actually supervised. It's a telemanipulator rather than an autonomous robot. Monitoring response, again, machine vision, pattern recognition could be very useful for that, and online CPD tools. So there are a whole range of ways in which AI could support those 7 tasks, and I put them back in the graph there. I'm not sure about building the therapeutic relationship. Listening to and examining the patient, maybe. Decision support, yes. Discussing options with the patient, risk communication, yes. Delivering treatments and procedures, I mentioned e-prescribing systems, surgical robots, and so on. Yeah. Monitoring response, and yeah, that pretty good at that. I'm not so sure, but yes, there's potential for monitoring competence and so on. So the next question is, so what challenges are there with healthcare AI? And that picture is Ted Shortliff, one of the founders of healthcare AI, at his green screen terminal in the AI lab at Stanford in 1976, developing a very early decision support system called MySim, rule-based system. So one of the big issues I think we still have is data, variable data quality, even misleading data sets sometimes. And this is, we're understanding a lot more about this now. But even in a major journal like Nature, less than 10 years ago, publications were using data which was really quite misleading and poor in quality. You probably know this fantastic example of a melanoma risk prediction tool trained on a huge library of photos of pigmented skin lesions, and it had a fantastic performance. Area under the ROC curve was 0.94. I mean, you can't wish for better than that, and it was certainly better than the average of 21 board certified dermatologists. However, one of the collaborators in that project had some concerns. She was a dermatologist, and she looked again at the data that was being used, for both training and in the test set. And she discovered, she's called Nala, and she discovered and published a year later that some of the images included this graticule or ruler, if you can see the bottom right-hand corner there of that image. And that graticule is only present in images that have been taken by dermatologists making the diagnosis of melanoma quite late on in the care pathway. Now, this was a tool that was designed for use by people at home or maybe in the primary care, so well before they got to see a dermatologist. So it was really quite misleading to include such images in the training data and the test data. And she says images with rulers were much more likely to be malignant. So the algorithm inadvertently learned that rulers are a signpost for malignancy. But of course, the ruler isn't going to be present in the early stages of the care pathway. So that was a rather misleading data set. Even with more modern tools like large language models, there's a risk of misleading training data. Obviously, you put huge amounts of text, large corpus drawn from many, many sources. Sometimes the sources are unknown, and that's a cause of concern. But hopefully it will include things like NICE guidelines, high quality systematic reviews from the Cochrane collaboration, etc. But the risk is that it may also include various kinds of poor quality text. For example, poorly designed individual studies, expert reviews and textbook chapters. We'll talk about those in a moment. Drug company typo their marketing material, social media, etc. We know that expert reviews and textbook chapters, they're a particular problem. And this was shown many years ago by Antman, that often experts are years, sometimes even more than 10 years behind the scientific evidence. And I'll show you that paper in a moment. So even ignoring any hallucinations, LLM output is unlikely to be as accurate as, for example, a Cochrane review or a NICE guide on a specific topic. Here's the abstract from Antman, and you can see here I've highlighted that there were discrepancies between the meta-analytic patterns of effectiveness in randomized trials and the recommendations of textbook authors and chapter people who'd written chapters and expert reviews. Review articles often failed to mention important advances or delayed recommending effective preventative, and sometimes they were treatments that were recommended that had no effect or even were potentially harmful, and they continued to be recommended by clinical experts. So an LLM looking at textbooks and expert reviews is going to get misled by this because the source material is misleading. This is probably one of the reasons why the widely hyped IBM Watson tool really fell on its feet, because it relied very heavily on expert opinion and carefully selected synthetic cases when it was deployed at a major US cancer center. And you can see that it went from the future of healthcare to sold off for parts in the early 20s. So IBM Watson was very much hyped, and it was a kind of early large language model, but it didn't deliver on its potential. So another big issue that we talk about is algorithms that are actually biased against certain subgroups of the population. And the reason for that is usually, again, an imperfect data set that doesn't include all of the subgroups that it meant to be applied to. And this is a positive story now of the 4C COVID mortality score, which was developed in the UK during the COVID pandemic and actually published in September 2020. And you can see it was developed using only eight variables from 35,000 patients. And sadly, those patients had a mortality rate of 32%, the inpatients. It was then validated on a second cohort of 22,000 patients with a slightly reduced mortality rate. It had, compared to the dermatology example, it had a much lower area under the RSC, only 0.79, but still that was better than the other scores that were available at the time. You can see, for example, like CURB 75, 65, and so on. The clever thing that the developers of this tool did, Knight and others, they looked for bias, And they looked for various different biases. It was a very thorough evaluation before they published. So they looked for gender bias, and you can see the area under the curve was pretty well identical for men and women. Strangely, the area under the curve for ethnic subgroups was actually better than the area under the curve for white people. And you can see the figures there. East Asian was the highest at 0.85. So there was no bias against ethnic groups, at least in terms of the discrimination. And equally, they looked for evidence that the tool might have been biased against or in favor of people from higher areas of higher deprivation. And their surrogate for that, they didn't have the deprivation category by postcode for each of the participants in the study, but they did look at whether they came from hospitals in the north of the UK, which tends to have higher deprivation than the south. And again, you can see there was, if anything, it performed better on slightly more deprived patients from the north. So it's an object lesson, I think, in looking for bias, and the fact that they included, it was very much a multi-center study, so they were able to include both people from different ethnic groups, people from deprivation, and obviously different genders. And that's what we really need to be doing routinely, and then checking for bias. Another technical problem is algorithmic drift, and there are many examples of this in the literature. This is one which Niels Peek kindly shared with me, something called Euroscore, which is about predicting the outcome, the mortality rate from cardiac surgery, developed as a result of a big European project. And you can see over the years, over 15 years, it started to produce higher predicted mortalities, whereas the actual death rate drifted downwards, probably due to safer operative procedures. And that's an example of algorithmic drift. And the question is, why do these things happen? So the problem is that the model performs very well on the test set if you draw it randomly from a training data set, but less well on test sets from other centers or later on from the same center. There's a whole range of reasons, and I won't go through the details of that, but certainly changes in clinical procedures, and changes in case mix over time, and even things like public awareness due to celebrity illness and so on. So people presenting earlier in the life history of their cancer, for example, means that the mortality will be lower, hopefully, and so the algorithm may get predictions wrong. There's a number of remedies for this. Obviously, start with a multi-center data set covering the entire population of interest. So it's a similar remedy to the one for biases. It's normally and very frequently in machine learning, we separate the training and the validation set randomly. And the recommendation to overcome secular trends, that's the algorithmic drift problem, is that you should separate it by era. In other words, use the most recent set of patients as the test set, not a random 20%, but the most recent 20%. And that should essentially test the validity of the model on the most recent patients you've got. And therefore, if it's reasonably accurate on those patients, it's probably going to be reasonably accurate on future patients. And obviously, we should be monitoring model performance over time and then retrain as needed in a periodic way, every few months, every year, etc. There are reasons, though, why we shouldn't be continuously retraining the model, because then you don't quite know what the model is every day when you come into work. Which model have we got today? So that's algorithmic drift. Another problem is not about the quality of the training data, but the quality of the data that we have at hand when we're actually using the AI. And remember, for decision support systems, you've got a health professional or patient putting data into an electronic patient record, and that data is that coded data is then used by the AI, whether it's a knowledge-based system or a machine learning derived algorithm, to generate output of some kind, reminder, advice, risk score, whatever it is. But the quality of the data in that electronic patient record is crucial to the accuracy of that reminder, that advice or risk score. And here's an example of how an excellent AI called QRisk2, which calculates individual cardiac risk, it's validated and updated annually by the Nottingham group. It caused a number of problems for a number of years. And it was because the system was used by a different GP system from the one from which it was derived. And they incorrectly mapped the data to the wrong EPR items. and then they failed to evaluate its accuracy as implemented. So the developer didn't actually look at the accuracy of the device as it was incorporated into their EPR. And that meant that hundreds of GPs received inaccurate advice, and unfortunately, thousands of patients were given poor advice and probably were prescribed statins or missed out on statins that they needed. So that's an example of how we need accurate advice in the EPR for using these systems, as well as for training the systems. Another issue, we always talk about the accuracy of the system, meaning discrimination, the area under the ROC, but there's another measure of accuracy called calibration. And if it's an algorithm that predicts an event with a probability of, say, 10% or 50%, then clinicians need to know that that 10% or that 50% figure is accurate. And what that means is that 1 in 10 of those patients with that prediction really die, or 1 in 2 if it's a 50% prediction. And the problem is that many algorithms seem to overestimate risk at the lower end and underestimate risk at the higher end. So what we need to do is to plot the probabilities of the events happening for different groups of patients with different predicted probabilities. And this, again, from that 4C COVID algorithm, is a great example of a calibration curve, which is really near perfect. It intercepts the graph at 0 and has a slope of 1.0. So what you want for an ideal calibration curve is a very different shape from an area under the ROC. You want a diagonal. With an area under the ROC on the diagonal, that means it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And there are some statistical metrics like the Breyer score and the AIC, which can also be used. But in many ways, a calibration curve is more revealing. It actually shows you how accurate are the predictions from the model, the predicted risks from the model. So that's the end of some of the technical things, which I think for clinical purposes are very important and which will help to convince clinicians to both trust and use the model. But there are some issues that come up, which I've called psychological challenges for AI in clinical settings. And perhaps the first and most important one is this assumption, myth, that it's all about accuracy. It's all about high performance in terms of accuracy, because the algorithm will be taking the decision, replacing human decision makers. The reality is that for the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years, until clinical culture and trust changes and AI reliability is fully established, particularly in high-risk settings, AI will not be taking decisions. It will be supporting humans. And that means that the users of the AI need to be able to find the output from the AI and then understand it and trust it. And the output can be any one of a whole range of different kinds. It can be text, it can be risk figures, it can be segmentation on a medical image, it could be a whole range of different kinds of output. And it's only once the user can find, understand, and trust that output that they will incorporate it into their decision. And that means the developer must present the output in a format that users find acceptable and trustworthy and persuasive, and that they can really understand. The trouble is, it's hard to know what kinds of output will be trustworthy and persuasive. And I think that the evidence for that statement is a big systematic review that was done in 2020 by Kwan, looking at 122 randomized trials of the impact of decision support systems of all kinds. And that systematic review covered over 1 million patients and 11,000 healthcare providers. So I think it's a very useful insight into which systems work and the fact that they actually don't work very well at the moment. You can see that the average impact was only a 6% improvement in adherence to best practice, whether it was prescribing or diagnosis, test ordering, etc. And in fact, different tasks, the impact was less for prescribing, interestingly, than for test ordering and diagnosis and so on. So I think this is partly because we haven't put enough effort into thinking about what kind of output do clinicians need to help them incorporate the advice into their decision making. And Jerry Osheroff in 2012 led a group, I think it was an AMIA group, looking at decision support, and they came up with what they call the 5 rights of clinical decision support. You've got to provide the right information to the right person using the right channel at the right moment in the workflow before the decision is made, but not too long before, and in the right format. And they weren't very explicit about what they meant about the right format, but I think this is a crucial point that we need to get the output in a format that people can read and understand. And here are some examples of bad advice format that you quite often see when you're looking at decision support systems. Simply putting the advice in capital letters makes it more difficult to read. And there are some information design principles which I reviewed with a psychologist in a 4 article series in the Lancet a few years ago, 25, 30 years ago now. It was a big mistake publishing that in the Lancet because, of course, the developers of decision support systems and AI never read a medical journal like that. But these are principles that are based on empirical studies done in the psychology literature. And there is actually a discipline called information design about how to design information so people can find it fast and interpret it without error. So capital letters are bad news. And there's a whole range of other things which can make text more difficult to understand. And often the advice is buried in the EPR interface as well. So you might consider, for example, a modal dialog box. So that quite often happens nowadays. Another problem is that the advice only appears on request, and Van der Velde showed in her systematic review of about 65 randomized trials that if you produce the advice automatically, it's much more likely to be effective than if you have to request the advice. And that, incidentally, was a systematic review of head-to-head trials, so trials in which people developed a decision support system which gave the advice automatically, and they also had the same decision support, but it was only available on request, and they randomized users to which version they received. So those were head-to-head trials of different features. It's a really interesting systematic view. Have a look if you can find it. Another problem might be, for example, if the output of the decision support system is a segmentation line, it's got to be bold. It's got to be clear and distinct from the image. And sometimes you see segmentation which is really quite poorly demarcated. Another example would be how you communicate risk. Even presenting it as a percentage is confusing. The worst thing probably is to present as a probability. There's a risk of 0.2. I mean, that really doesn't speak to humans and clinicians. And Gigerenzer, another psychologist, wrote a really nice article in BMJ and more actually since then, demonstrating from psychological experiments that if you use numbers like 20 out of 100 instead of 20% or 200 out of 1,000, that's much easier for humans to understand and incorporate in the decision making. However, here's an example of heart risk apps for the public. This was a student project from Leeds a few years ago now, looking at iPhone apps for risk calculation. And all 19 at that stage communicated risk using percentages. And one came up, we had various scenarios that we put in to calculate risk to check whether they were accurate. In one app, it produced a risk output of 137%. We really don't know what that is. We suspect that's an error. And one app, incidentally, most of them did not give any advice about what to do with these percentages. One app just said in a very defeatist way, go see your GP, whatever the risk estimate was. Pretty crazy. And those are heart risk apps for the public, not for clinicians. Another psychological problem, which I think we're all familiar with, it's alert fatigue. And in some studies, 96% of alerts are overrisen. And I've put that in a number format to demonstrate what you can do. That's 24 out of 25 or 96 out of 100, just to follow my own advice. We know that alert fatigue is a potent reason why these systems fail to bring about useful behavior change. And there have been some useful qualitative studies, probably more since that study in 2006, showing that people override alerts that they think are irrelevant or trivial, or they're shown repeatedly. They've seen it before. And I think often the problem is that the thresholds for alerts are set too low. So alerts are set to be too sensitive and insufficiently specific, possibly for medico-legal reasons. So alert fatigue is a psychological problem. The reverse almost of alert fatigue is automation bias. And this is a piece of work that Abdul and myself did with a PhD student, Kate Goddard, some years ago now, Abdul. Um, and this was stimulated by a study by Chuck Friedman and Fred Wolf and Arthur Elstein, who's another psychologist, published in JAMA 25 years ago, showing that although tools were quite popular back then, like Kioma and Iliad, were helpful in difficult case reports to help doctors make the right diagnosis. The doctor added the correct diagnosis to the list in 12% of cases, but unfortunately, in another 6%, they deleted the correct diagnosis from their list. So the net result was only a 6% improvement in diagnostic accuracy, and it's biggest for students and least for faculty. And that's called automation bias. And so Kate Goddard did a systematic review and some empirical studies looking at how to reduce automation bias. And the answer is that simply by repositioning the device on the screen, attaching confidence levels to it, or giving an assessment, not a recommendation, then you can stop clinicians from following advice that actually is wrong or inappropriate in their situation. You can also help by training and emphasizing user accountability. It's the user that is responsible for the decision, not the computer. And incidentally, automation bias isn't specific to healthcare. It was well recognized in aerospace. There are many case reports, sadly, of pilots flying into mountains which were not indicated on their instruments. So they ignored the evidence in front of their very own eyes because their ultimate was saying, no, it's fine. Now, moving on to Enrico Correa's great insight about the last mile. I think we're all familiar with the kind of timeline of developing an AI to support with an identified task. There's the first mile of capturing data, cleaning, labeling the data. Actually, obtaining access to data it may feel like much more than a mile, actually, the first mile. And then there's the middle mile, relatively simple process of building and testing alternative models until you're satisfied with the model that you've chosen. And then there's the very important last mile before you can get to the outcome of useful AI. And that's real world implementation and routine use. And covering that last mile is actually, again, a lot of work, a lot of challenges there. The AI needs to be connected with the real world to make a difference. And that means fitting it into local organization and local workflows and training and briefing the users and persuading them to use it. And that often means localizing the model and recalibrating it, not just as Enrico says, parachuting in an AI from another place. And the final point he makes is that we need to measure the impact of the AI on people, not just its accuracy or area under the curve. But Enrico doesn't go on to say how we should do that. And here are some suggestions. There's a whole range of studies that we could do to measure AI's impact on people to help overcome this last mile problem. And this is in order of increasing cost of the studies and also of the value of the studies. So there's a range of subjective studies. Now, I'm a quantitative researcher. I appreciate and acknowledge the importance of subjective studies. But unfortunately, even if you ask users their views on specific outputs of an AI, demonstrate the AI and then ask their opinion about it or the specific outputs. That's still not going to help you very much. These are very much formative studies. They will help you to improve the AI a bit. So that's what we mean by formative. But none of those are really summative. They're not going to help people decide about adoption. But there are a range of objective studies that you can do as well. So, for example, you can measure if the user's risk estimate or their advice on case scenarios or simulated cases differs from the AI's risk estimate or advice. That's very much a formative study. That would help you to improve the AI. The next step would be to measure if the AI actually improves their risk estimate in case scenarios. And I'll explain that there's a diagram coming. And then the final one is to measure if it, but that would be in case scenarios. Again, that's formative. The final would be to see whether it actually improves their risk estimate or decision in real practice. And that's a summative study. That's really a study that tells you, does the AI have a useful impact on real practice and hopefully real patients and health systems? So here's some diagrams showing these kind of the objectives, the three kinds of objective studies. The first one will be to compare the output from human and AI in different scenarios. And that's quite a useful study to do and a relatively simple one to do, and one we should be doing more often. The next one, and I'll give you a more detailed example of this in a moment, is first of all, you ask a person to give their verdict on a case scenario. So that's their output pre-AI. You also put that case scenario into the AI, but you don't show the person the output yet. Once you've got that output and you've got their verdict before they've seen the AI's output, you then give them the output and you look at whether their output changes, their verdict, their risk estimate, whatever it is, whether it changes in a positive direction after seeing the output from the AI. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. The final kind of study is when you randomize cases to either a user with the AI or a user without the AI, and you compare the decisions, actions, outcomes with and without the AI. Sorry about that French word creeping in there. Sans means without. I just didn't have space to put without. So those are the three possible studies that we can do, and all of them are very valuable. The problem with the third kind of study is if you didn't get the format of the output quite right, you might have a really good AI, but because the format of the output wasn't great, you might not see any benefit. And that's why it's really important and useful to do study number 2, looking at whether the output improves the risk estimate or the decision that the user makes in scenarios before you go to a randomized trial. So here's an example of what I call a type 2 study. This was, we were developing an app to advise junior doctors on blood transfusion because they use too much blood. We developed something called the Blood Choices app. It was registered as a type 1 device, and we wanted to know, is it likely to make a difference and how could we improve it before we go ahead and do the trial. So we assembled some anemia scenarios and asked 5 experts to give their verdict, and then we also recruited 26 junior doctors and selected the 5 scenarios with the closest expert agreement on the correct action. And I haven't got time to go into the detail, but it was surprising how variable those 5 experts were on their verdicts. And then we did an online study, and the design of the study was, first of all, the doctor read the scenario, asked whether to transfuse this patient or not, and also asked them about their certainty on a 1 to 100 scale. We then got them to read the other 5 scenarios. Then they were allowed to download the app and use it on a training scenario, which we didn't include in the results. And then finally, they were asked again to read the scenarios in a random order, actually, a different order from the previous part of the experiment. Enter the data into the app and asked whether they would transfuse or not once the app had given their advice. And the results you'll see was actually quite disappointing. The doctors were pretty good at making the right decision. Their decision accuracy was 83% before and 88%, only 5% better afterwards, which is similar to the results of that Quan systematic review, a mean of 6% improvement. However, one of the problems was that in doctors' hands, the junior doctors' hands, the app usually gave the wrong advice for one of the scenarios, because we realized that the labeling of the data input fields and the wording of the advice wasn't very clear for a junior doctor. It was okay for the experts, the transfusion experts, but the junior doctors were likely to either put the wrong data in or misinterpret the advice. So already this little study was proving very useful. The doctor accuracy on that scenario, you can see actually they were very good on it. They got it right before they saw the app's advice. They got it right 96%, but it halved to 46% due to automation bias. So they actually believed the app, but the app was giving them the wrong advice because of poor design, essentially. if you looked at the accuracy on the remaining four scenarios, it actually did provide quite a lot of help. It improved their accuracy by 13%. Surprisingly, the doctors said that the app gave up understandable advice and that they would use it in practice. So we got some valuable lessons from that small case study. Practical difficulties running the study. I said this problem of gaining consensus on gold standards was challenging. You need to assemble more scenarios than you actually need for the study and exclude those with poor consensus. One of the other issues was that the users, the junior doctors, said, "Oh, there isn't enough information. You need to give me more detail." The problem is that if we'd done that, it would have taken them far too long to do the study, and the completion rate would have dropped considerably. So we wouldn't have had as many results to analyze. But we had a number of benefits. For example, this issue with that scenario that the junior doctors were finding difficult to enter the data and understand the output of. And you can observe the users and ask them to feedback to inform revisions to the interface and the output wording. And you can also repeat the study when you've revised the app or the AI, or you can use it to compare two different formats for the output, for example, for risk communication. So it's a really powerful kind of study design, relatively low cost, relatively quick to do, and it stops you from making a big mistake if you're going to run a randomized trial and you haven't quite optimized the output yet. Incidentally, it also corresponds with the survey that we did a few years ago, asking some senior physicians who were the research leads for, I think it was 27 different specialist societies that were affiliated to the College of Physicians. We asked them what three aspects of decision support system quality need to be evaluated. And you can see the impact of the device on clinical decisions, patient outcomes, clinical actions, or NHS resource. That was the most important thing. And the accuracy, only 8 of them wanted the accuracy that they thought was the most important. So this really brings us on to the question of, do we need trials to measure the impacts of AI? I've suggested that type 3 study, a randomized trial. Yes, we do need it. The health technology assessment person in me says, yes, we definitely need it, because there are new expensive technologies competing for scarce health funding. They can have severe side effects. They'll spread very fast once they're being adopted, so it'll be too late to do trials. And there are strong industry pressures to adopt, so independent trials will help us to trust these tools. And doctors are always asking for trial results, and I think trials will help doctors to trust these systems. But there's also reasons why we might say no to trials. You could argue that decision support systems are just adding more information about a patient, a bit like a test or an image. And we adopt those new imaging methods and tests based on their sensitivity and specificity. There are very few randomized trials. They're actually, the ones that have been carried out are often very interesting and revealing. So following that point of view, you could say, well, surely accuracy is enough. Also, trials are expensive and could delay adoption, and the systems change fast, so it's a challenge to design a randomized trial that we can carry out quickly. But remember, big tech and industry use A/B testing, which is essentially a randomized trial all the time, and they have a cycle time of sometimes only hours before they introduce the results that their A/B testing has shown work. So if we get our act together, we could be doing A/B testing on rapid cycle times as well. And Joe Liu and myself wrote a piece about the case for randomized trials to assess the impact of clinical information systems in general a little while ago. Anyway, I'm keen to hear your comments and questions. Just quickly to conclude, I think we do need to tackle the many technical challenges, but we also need to be aware of and manage the psychological risks like alert fatigue and automation bias. And we need to move on to the last mile problems, to study the impact on user decisions using the simple psychological experiment that I've described, kind of pre-post experiments. And this is an opportunity to improve the output format, overcome the last mile problems, and I think will reduce the risks of negative trials when they AI itself is actually sound. It's just that you haven't got the wording or the format of the risk estimate quite right, so people aren't responding to it appropriately. So questions and discussion. I'll stop sharing there.